Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the Give Yourself Goosebumps series, and we're going to be looking at Special Edition number 2, Return to Terror Tower. Now, off the bat, I've mentioned this in the past, that the second Goosebumps book I've ever read, as a kid, when I was first ever getting into the Goosebumps series, was A Night in Terror Tower. And A Night in Terror Tower, I've read that book many times growing up. I can remember reading that book, once or twice all the way through, just because as a kid, reading was kind of like a leisure activity, and since A Night in Terror Tower was one of the few Goosebumps books I actually owned in my collection, I did read that one from time to time, especially on like colder months when I didn't feel like riding my bike to the library. And with this book in particular, I didn't know what how it would become rare or anything, but I think I remember trying to play this book once or twice as a kid, and thinking back on it, I don't really remember a lot about it until rereading it. And I can say for sure that it's probably because this, as a game book, is one of the hardest Give Yourself Goosebumps game books. This series is known for it being like a game, especially these special editions. They have these game functions to them, but this is definitely a hard one to complete. Not to mention, to even acquire this thing these days is going to be pricey. This is one of the more expensive Goosebumps books out there, and I feel very fortunate I own one. But man, with it being so expensive and so hard to complete, and it being a sequel to an original 62 book in the series, and it's, one of these later black spines, it's just a perfect storm for collectability. It's a very collectible book. Now, if you want to know, some thoughts before we get into the plot review and then my real thoughts near the end, I quite like this setup for this type of story. In a lot of ways, I think that this setup is better than what we got in the original 62 with the first book. And I quite enjoyed myself with it. Playing, trying to play it honestly once or twice made me appreciate the game function in this book and the difficulty of it. And then, going through with the bookmarks and just reading it as is, I really enjoyed how this book dived more into the lore of this, Terror Tower. Had some more characters that we didn't get to see in the first book, like King Robert, who was the king that was trying to kill Sue and Eddie, mild spoiler, from the first book. And it was more expansive and less repetitive, so off the bat, I would probably recommend this over the original in a lot of ways. And if you can get your hands on it, go out and find this, because this is a really intriguing one. It does have its problems, and I'll get into that near the end of the video, but yeah, this gets a recommend from me. A really, really good one. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So in Give Yourself Goosebumps, you are the main character, so you get to, interact with the story characters and make the decisions of where the story goes. Now, this being a Give Yourself Goosebumps Special Edition, often that means that when you go into these special editions, there's some type of prominent game function within the story. And in this book, I think there's, 3 levels of this game function that makes it so difficult. But the story starts you off, right? You are friends. You've been friends with these 2 kids named Sue and Eddie. And you've been friends with them for a few months. They're kind of new to the area where you live in the United States. And Sue and Eddie, they come back from the original book, and this picks up pretty much right where that book left off. And they're telling you this story about their experience in England and near the Terror Tower in London, and just how scary it was. And then they tell you that the reason why it was so scary is because they time traveled, and they realized that they're Prince Edward and Princess Susanna, from, the medieval times. And you kind of shrug this off. You're like, stop pulling my chain. And they're like, no, our dad is actually this sorcerer our real dad, hired, and he worked for, the family, and he sent us back to present day to protect us, and that's why we are here now. It's because if we go back in time, our real uncle wants to kill us. So you get into a situation where they tell you that they are planning to go back without telling Mordred, and using the stones from the previous book to go back in time on their own accord to help save the people under the uncle's thumb, because ever since they've escaped to modern times and the Lord High Executioner failed to, execute them, he's been lashing out on the public. So now it's up to them and you, potentially, to go back in time and save the people from the wrath of the uncle. So you're given a choice pretty much early on whether you can just decide to go or not. If you decide not to go, the book immediately ends and gives you your first ending. So you really have to decide to go. And once you decide to go, Eddie pulls out the stones and he starts chanting the magic spell. And then you start to feel kind of weird, and then you're put into another scenario where you're allowed to mess with the stones while he's doing the spell. And if you do so, you get sent to like this alternate universe, and the book ends you there. But if you don't interfere, you end up by yourself in this shack of hay in the past, and Sue and Eddie are nowhere to be found. You've been passed out. You wonder, maybe they woke up before you, and you start to wander around, and you come to find this note. And this note essentially tells you from Sue and Eddie that they, have hidden these two other stones. They've left you with one of the stones that sent them back in time. It's up to you now to go find the other two stones. And the reason why they want you to hold on to this note is because they might be captured and they might be executed by now, or maybe this note will fall into the wrong hands. But they entrust you with this note, and they need you to go find these stones that they hid and meet them, so they can, deal with King Robert later in the book. So, once you discover that, and you realize that you have one of the stones, now you have to be the hero and go find the other two stones. And this is where it takes you to the real point of the story. Normally, and give yourself goosebumps, it takes you to one path or the other. But since this is a special edition, this takes you to a crossroads where you can take 6 different paths. And for reference, the book tells you can go on page 135 in the back of the book and look at the map where you're going. Also, I forgot to mention this. Before you time traveled, Sue and Eddie told you to bring some items with you to the past that might be able to help you or them, be able to navigate, the medieval world. So you have a list of 4 items. I know that you can bring a pair of sunglasses, you can bring a music player, you can bring a flashlight, and I think a book bag, but I'm not quite sure on that 4th item. But you have to pick 3. Now, what makes this book hard, right, is that depending on what items that you take with you to the past will essentially determine what items you're able to find throughout the past. So this is the first tier of issue, in completing this book, honestly, when you're playing through it, is that you have to pick those right items. But then throughout the story, not only do you have to find the magic stones that they told you to go find and meet back up with them with, but you also have to pick up other items that will help you with certain characters. So you're forced, if you're playing this book honestly, to go down multiple paths. And if you choose the wrong one, you're going to keep having to go back to this point. And even if you get to the right point where you need to go, if you pick the wrong items that you took with you to the past, you're going to have to restart the whole book. So, yeah, this book's pretty difficult, right? So if you do the cheat bookmark method, you can just pretend like you have them all and just read it, though. But there's 6 paths you can take. The first 2 paths send you pretty much straight to the tower itself and a back, narrow passageway that takes you like behind the tower. And I'll get to those last. The other 4, there's one path that you can take that takes you to the forest, and in the forest you get to encounter Robin Hood. Not kidding. You get to encounter Robin Hood. Another path you take takes you to like a marketplace, and this is where you encounter this I forget, it's like the Earl of Worcester guy, and you have to deal with him. Another path will take you to this dragon cave where you have to deal with this talking dragon. And then the final one, I think, takes you through the slums a little bit, and it kind of bleeds into a few other paths as well. So, if you start, let's start with the dragon one. If you take the dragon path, you are now looking for, one of the magic stones. So you see this sign for a cave that says dragon ahead, but you're like, hey, dragons aren't real. But you decide to go ahead anyway. And then you encounter this cave with a bunch of charred, remains everywhere. And then there's a talking dragon asking to, what brings you here? You better have something I want, because he collects, some artifacts and some valuable things, as the dragon puts it. And he wants to know what you have. And you offer him up 2 items, and if you choose the wrong item, the dragon, does what he wants with you. But if you choose the right item, he, will accept that item and allow you to go pick up one of the stones that you need, and then you can go back, and then back to the, the pathway, and then hopefully find your way to Suinetti. So that's essentially the dragon one. If you choose the marketplace path, where you have the Earl of Worcester guy, you interact with him, and you can either choose to work for him or not work for him. And if you choose not to work for him, you essentially get chased off, and you fall into, a river, and some guards are overlooking you, and you have to pretty much fight a sea monster, and then you end up into this tunnel system where you get to go through these tunnels and stuff, and then you come across the back end part of the dragon's den, where all these skeletons are, charred skeletons with like putrid, old flesh on them, and they come to life. And one of the endings, the scariest part of this whole book, is dealing with that skeleton barrage in the cave in the back of the dragon's den. That was excellent stuff. But if you go back and you decide to work for the Duke essentially takes you to the tower where you need to go. Suinetti implied that that's where they'll be headed to deal with, King Robert. And there's a couple of ways you can navigate in the tower to get through it. If you choose one way, it will essentially take you to another path that I haven't talked about yet. That's a more direct path from early on. But you need an item to do so. If you don't have the item, you have to do the more complicated way, where the Worcester guy takes you to a room where there's a key. Now, if you take the key, you can collect the key and end up back in another crossroads and decide to go back to the direct path and do it that way. Or you can try to, say, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, and the Duke will just give you the key, and you get to, go, take a shortcut through and do it that way. But you still need an item, if you're playing it honestly, to get through to the next point. So you're pretty much forced to have to go back and forth throughout the book. So that's essentially that path with the marketplace. Now, another one we could talk about is the path. There's a path where you deal with some kids. You get off this, off the beaten path kind of route, and you deal with these kids. And these kids, are making a big fuss over you. And this path, you haven't changed clothes. You're still in your, old clothes, modern time clothes. So if you have an item they want, you can teach them, how to play with your, I think it's a soccer ball. That's what it is. If you brought the soccer ball, they get to kick the soccer ball and play with it. If you decide not to play with them, you can wander off and try to go hide. You hear some guards coming, and then there's this woman that says, hey, I can help you. Well, it turns out this woman is the woman that betrayed Sue from A Night in Terror Tower. And you end up getting a bad ending with her because she ends up ratting you out. And if you decide to play with the kids and you keep playing with the kids instead of going hiding with the woman, you distract them long enough to where you end up back on the right path, and you could take a shortcut through this other path. I know it sounds kind of complicated, but that's what it is. So those three are like the main side ones. And then the other three, there's a path that you get to take that will take you to Morgred's house. And when you get to Morgred's house, you get to see how his house is laid out, and you get to play with the spell book. And there's a bunch of spells in there, and there's a couple of endings with that as well. I think that's an add-on to the kids' path. Now that I'm thinking about it, but then we have the Robin Hood path, right? The Robin Hood path is probably the corniest path in this whole book, right? So you get to go to the woods, and then there's this cloaked figure that rescues you from these guards, and they say, "Hey, we're going to go see Robin," and you're like, "Who's Robin?" And when you decide to go find out who Robin is, you find this village of people who say that they are enemies of the King Robert, and in turn, Sue and Eddie. But once you tell them what happened to Sue and Eddie, they start to sympathize with you and say that they might go aid with you and wander off, even though we never see any resolution with that, given the real ending here, but it is what it is. And one part, like us, if you stay behind and talk with this woman, she reveals to you that she's actually the real Robin Hood, but the twist is you're not allowed to leave because, you're an outsider, and now it's so corny, but you have an ending where you get to, you give her a tagline, I forget what it is. Robin Hood's, Robin the rich for the poor or something. And Robin Hood's like, "I like that. Mind if I use it?" It's so corny. It's so tongue-in-cheek, this part of the book. But if there's these two mysterious guys that say, "Hey, you shouldn't trust this village. You should come with us." And if you follow them, they kind of go down this, mildly generic thing where they reveal that they're ogres and they have some motives with you because they tempt you with food. But there's a twist to it. So, that one was kind of hunky-dory. The whole forest path is probably my least favorite in the whole book. It's just really corny and nothing really all that special. But the two main ones are, like I said, the direct path to the Terror Tower and the dirt path that leads behind it. Now, like I said, if you're playing this game book honestly, if you try to take both of these paths head on, you're not going to have any of the items you need because, like I said, there's parts of the story, like if you deal with the Worcester guy, there's something you could pick up there. If you go to the wizard's house, there's an item you pick up there that you might need. So it's important that you go through these other parts before you go to these first two options. But if you take the dirt road going the back way, there's a couple things that you encounter. You end up into the castle, and you interact with the Lord High Executioner, and this is where you get to see the Executioner's lair and his minions, and there's a couple of dark endings with the Executioner there with you that are pretty fun. But if you manage to escape him and you go down this other option and you have the right items, you find Sue and Eddie, and Sue and Eddie lead you and they explore the tower, and then they find this room where all King Robert is with his cohorts that you're supposed to get into. And one of the endings, I guess this is one of the true endings, where they go in there, you go in there with the right items, you can just take King Robert out with the items, and then Sue and Eddie drop a bombshell on you when you say, "Okay, we've done what we're supposed to do, can we go back to the previous time?" And they say, "Well, no," and they explain why, and they tie you together deeper into the story per se, which kind of doesn't make the most sense, and we'll get into that near the end of the book, end of the video. But that part left a lot of questions. But the real path that gives you the real ending is the first option. Now, if you feel brave enough and you think that you have all the right items, you can take the first option and you can just go straight into the tower, and you have to deal with the Lord High Executioner head on, but you get to deal with him with the items. And if you manage to defeat him, you get to meet up with Sue and Eddie. And if you find a path where you stumble through and you accidentally bump into the chair of the king. That's pretty much the real ending there. So you deal with the king. There's something that you learn throughout the story, whether it's the king's scepter or the king's pendant that he wears around his neck that gives him power over people. And if you remember the right item, you can take the item from the king, which renders him powerless. And essentially the twist is, I don't want to spoil it because this is the real ending, is that if you go back to the beginning of the story where Sue and Eddie want to go back and help the people that the king is controlling and, you know, lashing out on, you get to see what this item has been doing to these people. And it may or may not be a magic item. And once you take it, something happens to the king. And something happens to you, Sue and Eddie, as well. And you get this, I guess, climactic finish. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, Return of Terror Tower. There's really nothing else to talk about. So let's get into the positives with this book. The positives to this book, off the bat, I would say the game function. And like I said before, I think the game function is so hard. Let me explain this further now. The game function itself, like I said, you have to pick between 4 items that you have to take with you to the past. Depending on what items you have, allow you to pick up the items in the past that you need to be able to defeat the Lord High Executioner, or these items will help you gain access to information that you might need to get to the true ending. So it's very important on what items you bring to the past. And it's also important while in the past that you go through multiple paths, because you have to make a mental note, because you're probably going to have to play this, if you're trying to play this book honestly, you're probably going to take quite a few tries to get to where you need to go with the right items. But that's the second tier of it. Now the third thing is, if in order to get to the final, like the real ending, you have to have the exact items. You have to have the key, which you need items to get to that. You need to have the stones, which you need to gather from the Dragon's Cave, and I think another place, which I think is the wizard's house. So if you don't go to those, you're not going to have the stones, and you're not going to be able to get to the real ending. So that's the third level of difficulty there. So the game function is really good. I mean, really good. And there's also a map that you can reference in here. The map looks really cool. It lays out like the path that you're going. So in your mind, you can be like, if I take this path, it will lead me here at some point. So it's visual, and the item function is really cool. So A+ for the game function. Probably one of the best game functions in Give Yourself Goosebumps, for real. Let's go into some other positives. There are some really scary scenes in this book. Like the skeleton in the dragon's den was awesome. That's one of the scariest things about this book. That really got to me. That whole path where you go through the market, and if you decide to run away from the guards and you fall into the river and you have to go through these dark tunnels, that's all really great. The stuff with the Lord High Executioner was really fun. Seeing him back was great. It's honestly so refreshing not seeing repetitive chase scenes, and you actually get to explore the tower itself. You actually get to explore the area around without really running away. You're more looking for things. So it's like a scavenger hunt type of story, which is a fun change up from the original book. And it's way more immersive than the original A Night in Terror Tower, I would say. And that makes it really fun. And seeing all these characters, like Sue and Eddie, is great as always. Seeing them back in the story. They're not here as much as you would think, but it's so cool having them back. And they're very heroic. They've taken on their prince and princess monikers, and they've really honored that. And I really can appreciate that about those characters. And we get to finally meet King Robert, who was really the heart of it, the villain of the original book. And seeing him and hearing some backstory about him was really cool. There's some backstory I don't want to spoil about him, but it's really intriguing. And the magic and sorcery element to it, there's dragons and medieval stuff. The atmosphere is just as good as the original. Maybe not as fluid and maybe not as descriptive, But I was shocked by how well this book was able to portray story, because a lot of the times in these Give Yourself Goosebumps books, there's story, but it's more like action focused story, where this actually tried to set up plot. It actually tried to build on the previous book. Maybe not the best, maybe not the fullest, but it tried. And it felt different than your normal Give Yourself Goosebumps book. You can tell that there's more efforts in story there than usual. So I really appreciated it. And yeah, pretty strong positives. I mean, from I have a lot to praise about it, but I do have some negatives with it. Now, let's just get the big one off. the whole Robin Hood arc, path, whatever you want to call it, I was not a fan of. It was so corny, kind of cliche. The endings were bad, some really bad ones. Not the worst I've seen in these books, but they had my eyes rolling a little bit, and it was just not for me. I mean, that stuff, I could live without. Everything else was fine. Just the Robin Hood path as a whole was just a big old miss for me. And getting into some other things, there are a little bit of loose endings. There's one ending that you can interpret as a true ending, but not really. That's the one where Sue gives you that bombshell that you can't go back. There's one path you could take where Sue drops a bombshell that you can't go back to the modern times for a specific reason. And when you hear that, and you realize that Morgred the wizard isn't in the past with you, when you hear what they say, I don't want to spoil exactly what it is, but essentially, all I can think about is it makes no sense, because if you're tied to this Morgred guy and he's not in the past with you, and you had this intention with me, the reader, why wouldn't you assure that he's in the past with you before you make this choice? It just comes off kind of, just for the sake of a twist, to, subvert some expectations there to the reader. It doesn't make a lot of logical sense. So yeah. And one last negative is that some of the paths, like I said, the crossroads is where you get to go through the 6 different paths in the story. And some of the paths, some of the choices you make take you back to the crossroads point way too quick. And if it was only one, I wouldn't really mention it, but it was like 2 or 3 of them that pretty much almost immediately sent you back to the crossroads. And some of them did go more expansive, but you had to have some items to do so. Now, if you're doing the whole bookmark cheat, that really doesn't matter. But if you're actually playing the book, honestly, that would be frustrating, because you're going to keep looping around. And then when you finally realize, that you need this item and you don't have it, you're going to have to pretty much restart the book. And that's just kind of frustrating. But even with the bookmark method, it felt kind of annoying. Like, okay, you had all this build up for this, and then you just shoot you back to the crossroads. Wasn't a fan of that. And one last thing, I really wouldn't consider this a negative, as a whole, right? But if I'm being completely honest here, as a sequel to A Night in Terror Tower, it's fun in the lore building. It's fun in exploring characters we didn't get to meet before. It's fun to see these characters again. You get some backstory there. But I don't really feel like, as a sequel, this really adds all that much. I think when it really comes down to it, I found when I was genuinely trying to play the book, I was having a lot of fun. Because the item function made it difficult, and I understood the difficulty. And it made it challenging, and it made me want to try and figure out what items I need. So I had more fun actually playing it. Now, when I sat down and just did the bookmark cheat just to finish the book, I wasn't having as much fun, because the story kind of got more action focused, and all this action focus doesn't really focus on building a story out of this, what's happening, unless you pick the precise path that you need. So, I don't know. Part of me wishes that this could have been a normal book, and part of me really loves it that it's a game book. Like I said, it's not really a negative I will deduct anything on. I just said, all I have to say is, I think I have more fun playing the book than actually just going through and bookmarking and just reading the book. So that's kind of sad a little bit. So, from a 0 to 5-star basis, I didn't come out fully loving this one, so it's not going to be a 4.5 or higher. But I did decide that I think this book is a very good one. I mean, especially if you're a fan of the original Night in Terror Tower or you've read the book many times, this one is well worth the read. I mean, well worth it. Now, do I like it more than a Night in Terror Tower, the original? I think so. I think I like this more. But how much more? It didn't... I can't really put it on the same level as something like Your Plant Food that gave a 4.4 out of 5, only because I think that book had me a little more. Just the chasings were kind of repetitive. This one, I think I like just a smidgen less, but I do, like I said, like it more than the original Night in Terror Tower. So I settled with a 4.3 out of 5, and I only deducted 0.7 off the top for those issues I had. A high B to a B plus of a book. I would go out of my way to recommend this one. Seriously. If you can afford it, or you find it on archive or wherever, or your library has it, get your hands on this and try this out. If you're trying to play it, it's going to be difficult. The difficulty, it's a hard one. But if you just do the bookmark method, I think you can still have a little bit of fun with it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Return to Terror Tower. Let me know down in the comment section down below. Do you love this book? Do you hate this book? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.